Let's take a look at iterators. Iterators are special methods that we can use on arrays and hashes to process each element inside that array or hash. So this is helpful when we need to repeat an action multiple times on these types of objects. So let's check it out. What we're going to do is create an array here. We'll just call it array1. And we'll do, let's just put random months inside the array. So to iterate over the array, we use this special method called the each method. So we use that same variable name and then we'll do .each. Now follow this syntax carefully. You don't necessarily need to memorize this right away, but you're going to see this quite a bit in Rails applications. So what we've done here is we're saying for each one of these items in this array, okay, so we have these 3 different months here. Let's assume just for a second that it's called X. Okay, so the first element, January here, let's assume that we're going to call it X for now. And then what we're going to do is do something with that variable X. Okay, so we're creating a temporary variable essentially right here in between these 2 pipe characters. And then we're going to do something with it. And that's what this do and end mean, right? So anything that happens inside this do and end code block here is what we're going to do with that temporary variable. So let's try this out. And what that's going to do is when you have this .each here, it's going to do that for each one, right? So it's going to assume that January is X, and then we'll do whatever code we want with January here, since it's kind of temporarily been labeled X. And then we're going to loop through and go to the second one here and say, okay, now let's assume that February is X. Let's do this piece of code to February, and so on. So the result will look like this. If we run this code, all it's doing is going through the array and just outputting the names themselves, these strings. Okay, so we could see this in a little bit a different context by doing something like this. So we're using string interpolation here to drop this variable inside of a string. Remember, if we're ever going to use variables inside of strings, we have to use string interpolation, which is that kind of structure right there. And now if we execute this, there you go. What it's doing is for each element in this array, it's going in there and it's doing a piece of code, running this piece of code for it. So that's a little bit about using each. Now, we can do a shorthand version of this. So right now this is consuming 3 lines of code. We can actually write this a little bit shorter by condensing it to 1 line. And all we have to do that, it's pretty simple. We just convert the do and the end into curly braces. So we go like this and make the do an opening curly brace, and we'll turn the end into a closing curly brace. And now let's just condense it all into 1 line. Now if I save it and I run this, it's going to work just the same. So to illustrate this point further, let's try this now with an array of numbers. So I'll just put a few random numbers in here. So what we're doing is we're taking this array that we called array1 and we're using the .each method. And we're doing it with the shorthand format, obviously. And then what we're going to do is assume that each number takes on this identity of this variable here, X. Now, to the code to the right of this pipe structure here, we're going to write in whatever we want to do with those values. So let's just output some manipulation of those numbers to the actual console. So we could do +5. So what this will do is it'll go through this array, and for each number it's going to say, okay, let's assume that this 1 here, this first element, let's call it X for a second. and let's take x and add 5 to it. So what it's going to do is do 1 plus 5 and then output that result into the console. And then since we have this each here, it's going to do that for each element in the array. It's going to go in and do it again for the 2 here, the second element, and so on. So let's take a look at this in the console. So if I run this code, you'll see there we go. It's added 5 to each of the elements in the array. Now likewise, there's a similar method that you can learn about. It's called map. And you might see this in production applications quite a bit as well. And what this will do is take the values that it calculates like each does, but it'll store it in a new array. It's going to output it into a new array. And we can kind of illustrate that just by doing something like this. Let's get rid of this output here so we don't output each of the values of this new array using map. What we'll do is just have it do the calculation, and we'll store all of this into a new array. And this is a really cool point right here, as you can see that variables can be assigned to fairly complex, calculations, methods, or other objects. So we're just going to say, okay, whatever comes out of this right here, we're going to assign it to a new variable. And you'll see that the result of this is going to be a new array since we're using map. So I can just do print array2, and if I run this, there you go. We have a new array called array2, and it's been mapped out. And if I print the first array next to it, let's put a line break there in between. So array1 still exists, and it's what we first declared it as. So now if I run this, you'll see there we go. So here's array2, which is this calculation. And remember, since we used .map, it's going to create a new array. .each wouldn't do that for us. So, and now we can see array1 down here. So that's how we iterate through an array. Each method is a very useful iterator. And remember, you can always go back to this website here to read more about all of the other kinds of methods that you can use. I mean, there's quite a bit of very interesting and creative things that can be done with these list type data structures in the Ruby language. So let's just take a look at one more example here. We're going to do a similar thing with hashes. So let's create another hash here. So first hash, and we'll just put some things in it. We'll say and I want to point something out. You can do this format for the hashes, or I can show you the more updated format, and I'll show you that next. So this can be rewritten in a little bit of a cleaner format. So ever since Ruby 1.9, since that version of the language, there's been a little bit of a cleaner way to write this. And instead of writing it like that, we could just write it like this. And I'll store this in a second variable just to print out both of them and show you that the result is the exact same. So let's put the same exact key value pairs inside this new hash here. And notice the way I'm typing it this time. It's a little bit different. We're not using the hash rockets, and the colon goes on the end of these symbols here, or keys as we call them, for each key value pair. So now if I were to output both of these into the console, you'll see that they're identical according to Ruby. So let's execute that. And we just need to make sure we have S's on the end of these. And there you go. These are literally identical. So you can write them two ways, and that's important to know because you'll see it both ways in production applications. So this is just a little bit cleaner when we write it this way. So let's keep that second one since it's a little cleaner. And let's finally just do this iterator for it. So we can do the same thing like we did for arrays, but you'll notice that there's one little catch with the hashes. So we'll do the longhand format. And the catch is that instead of just having one variable inside of here, it's useful to be able to kind of, reach in and access both the key and the value. So we can have two variables, and the first one will act as the key, and the second will act as the value. And so once again, I can just output some stuff. So for each key value pair, we can do something with the code. And so this is how we'll do it. We'll just say, we'll use string interpolation and just output this stuff into the actual console. So what this code is going to do is it's going to look at this hash here and it's going to say, okay, we have some key value pairs. Let's go in and print out, let's assume that this first key value pair here, okay, it's first name and John. Let's assume that the key is called first name and we'll just assign it to this temporary variable k. And then let's take this value here, John, and assign it to this temporary variable v. And then what we'll do is use these temporary variables in some block of code. Now this is very basic, we're just outputting it into the console, but it'll do it for this first pair and then it'll go through and keep iterating through until it hits the end. So then when it gets to the second one, it's going to say, okay, now let's assume that last name is K and doe here is V, and let's do something with that code. So if we run this now in the console, you'll see there we go. It's output the code with commas in between because that's what we've asked for it to do for each pair here.